lurid rumours in the press, together with several scares and false alarms, ensured that the atmosphere in Whitechapel remained tense, and the police were nervously apprehensive that another killing was inevitable. Large bodies of plainclothes policemen were therefore drafted into the district from other parts of London, and these, together with the detectives already on the ground, were so numerous that in the more deserted thoroughfares, almost every man met with was a police officer. October passed with no further murders, and by early November, the area as a whole had breathed a huge sigh of relief as it seemed that the nightmare had ended. In the early hours of the 9th of November, 25-year-old Mary Kelly was heard singing in a room at number 13 Miller's Court. A little before 2 a.m, a casual labourer named George Hutchinson met her on Commercial Street. She asked if he would lend her sixpence. He told her that he had no money. Observing that she'd just have to find it some other way, Mary Kelly continued along the street. A man coming from the opposite direction tapped her on the shoulder. She turned and spoke with him. They started laughing, and Mary Kelly took the man by the arm and led him back along Commercial Street, walking straight past Hutchinson. He later recalled how the man stared at him in a sinister fashion. Mary Kelly led the man along Dorset Street and into Miller's Court. Hutchinson waited outside for 45 minutes, but when nothing happened, he left the scene. Shortly before 4 a.m, two of Mary's neighbours heard a soft cry of murder, but since such cries were a common occurrence in the area, they both ignored it. At 10:45 a.m. on the 9th of November 1888, Mary Kelly's landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, round to number 13 Miller's Court to collect her overdue rent. Moments later, an ashen-faced Bowyer returned. "Governor," he stammered, "I knocked on the door. I could not make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood." The two men hurried back to Miller's Court, where, looking through the broken window, John McCarthy gazed upon an horrific sight. The bedside table was covered with what appeared to be lumps of human flesh, and there, on the bed, barely recognizable as human, lay the mutilated body of Mary Kelly. Soon, Inspectors Walter Dew and Walter Beck had arrived at the scene, and by 11:30 a.m, Inspector Aberline had joined them. But amazingly, it would be another 2 hours before any of them entered Mary Kelly's room.
There was a delay between Mary Kelly's body being discovered by Thomas Bowyer, who had gone there to collect the rent, and the police actually entering the room, because somebody mistakenly believed that bloodhounds were going to be brought to the scene. And in fact they weren't, but they didn't know that. And it was only when a senior officer came along and said that there were going to be no bloodhounds that the police finally forced the door and entered the room.
They couldn't actually get into the room because for some reason they thought the murderer must have had the key and locked the door. So in fact, when the people actually got into the room, they actually had to knock it down with an axe. They had to use a pickaxe to get into the room.
John McCarthy, Mary Kelly's landlord, was no doubt giving vent to the feelings of all who witnessed the bloody carnage inside number 13 Miller's Court, when later that day he told a reporter, "The sight that we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than the work of a man. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again."
Mary Kelly had her throat cut from left to right back to the spinal column, just like the other victims. She was stabbed, ripped up from the rectum to the breastbone, disemboweled, various organs were taken away. Apart from her body, her face was almost hacked beyond recognition. Her ears were cut off, her nose, her eyebrows, her lips. Complete disfigurement of the corpse took place in Miller's Court.
The day, however, held a further surprise for the beleaguered detectives, because they went about their by now familiar routine of searching for clues and suspects. Word arrived that their commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, had resigned.
Sir Sir Charles Warren had tendered his resignation several times over his term of office and had resigned sometime before the last murder. It just so happened that the resignation was accepted just before the murder took place, and that he left office on the day that it happened. He hadn't in fact gone. He still remained Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police because he hadn't been replaced. Nobody had been appointed in his stead.
The week that followed Mary Kelly's murder saw an intense flurry of police activity. A hasty inquest was held on Monday the 12th of November and was brought to a close that same day, probably at the request of the police, in order to starve the press of the salacious gossip and gory detail of which they had made so much during the protracted inquests into the previous murders. The number of plainclothes officers in the area was increased from 89 to 143, and these men patrolled the streets of Whitechapel once darkness had fallen. Meanwhile, the Home Office authorised Sir Charles Warren, who despite his resignation still remained at his post, to issue a notice offering a pardon to any accomplice who would give information that would lead to the discovery and conviction of the killer. And the fresh panic that was now gripping the capital even snapped the patience of Queen Victoria, who fired off an angry missive to her Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury.
Queen Victoria had an active sort of interest in this case right from the beginning, really. She actually had various petitions sent to her throughout the investigation by various groups trying to get things done. But actually after the double murder, she actually telephoned the Home Office to express her shock and to try and get information from them. And she telegrammed her Prime Minister the day after Mary Kelly's murder, and he says this new, most ghastly murder shows the absolute necessity for some very decided action. All these courts must be lit and our detectives improved. So she obviously really had a passion for this case to try and stop these murders from happening and to try and catch the perpetrator.
At noon on Monday the 19th of November, the bell at St Leonard's Church in Shoreditch began to toll a morning knell as a coffin of elm and oak was carried out of the gates in front of a crowd some several thousand strong. Men and women alike could barely control their emotions as the funeral procession set off for St Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leighton. It was with great difficulty that the police forced a path for the cortege, as onlookers jostled to touch the coffin and read its simple brass plate, Marie Jeanette Kelly, died 9th of November 1888, aged 25 years.
What nobody could have realised as Mary Kelly was laid to rest was that in Miller's Court, Jack the Ripper had performed his swan song. That knowledge would be the knowledge of hindsight.
In the weeks that followed, the panic and fear that had gripped the neighbourhood throughout the autumn began to abate as the residents turned their attentions once more to their everyday struggle for survival, and the press began to focus on other matters and other areas.
It's noticeable that in the case of Mary Kelly, when all the theorising and all the story and all the inquest had finished, it's almost as if somebody had just switched off a switch and the whole interest in the case just suddenly virtually died, and it was revived over the next few years every now and again. But after that one flurry, that one burst of press interest, the whole thing died.
Over 100 years have now passed since the so-called Autumn of Terror, and easily as many suspects have been put forward as likely perpetrators of the crimes. Some are just downright ridiculous. Others seem highly possible, but lack the elusive grail of cast iron proof. Today, as many books have shown, it is possible to put just about anybody into the frame and then build a plausible sounding case against them. The truth is that if we're to stand any chance of solving the mystery, we must put the crimes back into the context of the age and the streets in which they occurred. Then, and only then, do you stand any chance of solving what is without doubt the world's greatest whodunit. And one of the first problems to face the budding ripperologist is exactly how many of the Whitechapel murders were at the hands of Jack the Ripper.
Officially, there were only 5 Jack the Ripper victims, although there were 2 other murders that happened before that of Polly Nichols, which most history books considered the first Jack the Ripper murder. The murders of Emma Elizabeth Smith in April 1888 and that of Martha Tabram or Turner in August 1888 are considered by some people to have been the early sort of works of Jack the Ripper. So officially there's only 5, but there may have been 2 others before that. And there were a couple of copycats later on in 1889 and sort of later, Alice Mackenzie and Francis Coles.
In the century and more since the murders occurred, the Victorian police have been subjected to a constant barrage of criticism owing to their apparent inability to catch the killer. This is largely undeserved. They were, after all, hampered by a lack of modern investigative techniques. DNA profiling, forensic science, even fingerprinting were not established forms of police procedure. And can we, in all honesty, say that modern methods would have fared any better against a lone murderer who is not known to his victims and who leaves no clues behind? Indeed, it can be argued that, given the resources available to them, Inspector Aberline and his fellow detectives did a first-rate job. And let us not forget that if, as seems likely, Mary Kelly was Jack the Ripper's final victim, then something most certainly happened to the killer when he left behind the bloody carnage at Miller's Court.
The fact is, the murders stopped for a reason, and the only reason can have been that something happened to the murderer to stop him killing. Was he caught? Did he die? Was he incarcerated in a lunatic asylum? Murderers like this don't give up. Murderers like this continue unless they are caught.
A number of senior officers are on record as having said that, or having favoured certain suspects as being Jack the Ripper. Most famously, there is Sir Robert Anderson and Donald Sutherland Swanson.
In 1910, Sir Robert Anderson, as he had then become, wrote his memoirs entitled The Lighter Side of My Official Life. And in those memoirs, he states the following.
Undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the Jack the Ripper crimes do not fall into this category. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course. In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact. I will merely add that the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to testify.
So, not only does Anderson say that the police caught Jack the Ripper, he also claims that there was a witness who had seen the face of the murderer. But who was that witness? Well, it can only have been one of 2 people. Either Israel Schwartz, who saw the man attack Elizabeth Stride, or Joseph Luenda, who saw Catherine Eddowes talking with the man outside Mitre Square.
I would personally say that it was Israel Schwartz, because Anderson also said that this man was the only person to have got a good view of the murderer. And Lavender only had took a passing look at the man that he saw and really didn't pay very much attention at all, and consistently said afterwards that he would not be in a position to identify the man if confronted with him.
Sir Robert Anderson presented a copy of his memoirs to his old colleague and fellow Ripper investigator, Donald Sutherland Swanson. In the 1980s, Swanson's grandson gave that copy to the Daily Telegraph. Penciled notes that Swanson had scribbled into the margin of the book certainly made for interesting reading and brought modern-day Ripper investigators considerably closer to identifying Anderson's suspect.
And he says the suspect was called Kosminski. Doesn't give us a Christian name, but insofar as research thus far has been able to reveal, there is only one Kosminski that could fit the bill, because we're told that this Kosminski was committed to an asylum, and the only Kosminski found in the asylum records, which was found by Martin Fido, is a man called Aaron Kosminski.
Swanson also says that the reason the witness would not give evidence was because the suspect was also a Jew, and the witness's evidence would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not want on his mind.
If we believe the marginalia, then there was some reason why the police suspected him. He was taken with difficulty to a place called the Seaside Home to be identified, and that was probably the convalescent police seaside home in Brighton, where he was positively identified. The police then, for reasons which baffle everybody, released him. Now the probability is that they didn't have grounds for holding on to him any longer. Habeas Corpus Act means that you have to bring charges within a given period of time, or you have to release the individual. If they were not prepared to bring charges because our witness apparently refused to testify or to give evidence, the police would have had to have released him. He then was returned to his brother's house in the heart of Whitechapel, and his family almost immediately appear to have had him committed into the asylum.
In early 1891, Aaron Kosminski was officially found to be of unsound mind, and on the 7th of February he was committed to the County Lunatic Asylum at Colney Hatch in North London.
In 1988, researchers began combing the records for that elusive piece of information that might prove Kosminski's guilt once and for all. That search brought two investigators to the door of Zena Shine, who was born in the East End of London in 1925, and whose great-uncle, Aaron Kosminski, was indeed committed to Colney Hatch Asylum.
It was astonishing. Two men knocked at the door, and they said that there's somebody living here who knew the Kosminski family. They said that it was a centenary or something, and that the case had remained open. And they said, do you have a relation called Kosminski? And I said it was my grandfather. They said, did I know the rest of the family? I said, I think he had a brother. And they told me about this brother, Aaron. They said that we think he died in Colney Hatch. Colney Hatch, you know, things began to come back. All these little stories. All the family used to talk about Colney Hatch. And it was a major disgrace, the brother. After a little while, I began to understand a bit of Yiddish, and I could understand what they were talking about a bit here and there. They used to sort of, Aaron. It was sort of very deprecating, and there was never any lengthy discussion. It was always just a reference. But there was never any connection. It didn't mean anything to me. I couldn't understand the significance of anything. And when I told my brother, he was so appalled, he didn't even think it was funny, he was appalled. He said, if that's your claim to fame, forget it. Who wants to be connected to somebody, really?
And so we find ourselves today in the position of probably knowing more about the major suspect than the majority of the detectives at the time knew. Yet that final piece of the jigsaw eludes us. If we could only uncover the evidence on which Anderson and Swanson based their suspicions, it might be possible for us to complete the puzzle and solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper once and for all. Unfortunately, many of the papers relating to the Jack the Ripper investigation have either been destroyed or else have disappeared from the official files, and without them it is impossible to establish the guilt of one particular suspect above all others.
I haven't the remotest idea who Jack the Ripper was. I would put Kosminski at the top of the totem pole, as it were, simply because Anderson and Swanson were the two most senior officers investigating the Ripper case, and it's reasonable to assume that they would have known the evidence against every major suspect. And if they thought that the evidence against Kosminski was better than the evidence against any of the others, Kosminski would be the probable leading contender for the mantle of being Jack the Ripper.
One thing, however, is certain. The legend of Jack the Ripper refuses to die, and interest in him increases with every year that passes. And with so many dedicated researchers still on his trail, the day may yet come when Jack the Ripper is finally brought to book.
Until then, he will remain much what he has been for over 100 years, an elusive nightmare that haunts our imaginations, where he is able to instill feelings of fear and fascination in equal measure. But his story also provides a window through which we can gaze back onto a bygone age when a lone figure stalking the streets of London really did succeed in shaking the British establishment to its very core.